There's a moment in today's game where Frank Marshall places a queen on a square and every single person watching must have thought he'd lost his mind. We'll get there. But to understand why that queen move is one of the most jaw-dropping moves in chess history, you have to understand everything that built up to it. The game was played in Breslau, 1912, and Frank Marshall, the American champion who held that title for over 2 decades, was facing off against Stefan Levitsky, who was no pushover either. So this wasn't going to be an easy game where one player easily bullies the other, but rather quite the opposite. The game opens with d4 and e6, which eventually transposes into a French defense structure after e4 and d5. White plays knight to c3, the classical French, and Marshall responds with c5. Now, in the modern era, c5 here is considered a bit suspect. The problem is, after the sequence of exchanges in the center, black can end up with an isolated pawn on d5. An isolated pawn is exactly what it sounds like, a pawn with no neighboring pawns to protect it. It becomes a chronic weakness, especially in endgames, because it can only be defended by pieces rather than other pawns. But you see, an isolated pawn is also a source of space and energy. The player who carries it gets open files, active pieces, and the kind of dynamic imbalance that rewards aggression. Marshall knew this, and his plan was to sort of reinforce that pawn and build his pieces around it. Knight to f3, knight to c6, one trade happens, and again here white could take this pawn, but we get bishop e2 first, knight to f6, Levitsky castles kingside, bishop to e7, bishop g5, and then short castle. Practically, at this point, both players have sort of tucked their king away, gotten their pieces out, and are ready for further action. Levitsky plays pawn takes c5, eliminating Marshall's c-pawn and creating that isolated d-pawn officially. Marshall responds with bishop to e6, showing his first real sign of patience. There's a pawn hanging on c5 that Marshall could grab right now, and most players would take it without thinking. Marshall doesn't. He develops the bishop to e6 first, reinforcing his position, getting a piece to an active square, and only then worrying about the pawn. Knight to d4, a powerful centralization, and then bishop takes c5, finally grabbing the pawn he left on the board a move ago, but now doing it on his own terms. This move is also an invitation to take the bishop on e6. Levitsky accepts, knight takes e6, and Marshall recaptures with pawn takes e6. The bishop is gone, and on the surface it looks like Marshall has given up a bishop for a knight without a great reason. Bishops are generally worth a little more than knights in open positions, and this position is open. So why does Marshall do it? 2 things happen simultaneously when that trade goes through. The first is that Marshall's isolated pawn disappears entirely. His pawn structure is now connected and healthy. The entire strategic premise of Levitsky's position, the knight on d4, the pressure on d5, the long-term squeeze, has quietly evaporated. The second is that the recapture with the f-pawn opens the f-file. Marshall's rook is now staring down a potentially open file if the knight moves later in the future. Levitsky immediately spots his own opportunity. With the pawn restructured, he attacks what looks like an undefended pawn, and here is a small trap that Marshall has to navigate cleanly. He can't just take the bishop because his queen would hang immediately. So he plays queen to d6 instead, stepping out of the pin, defending what needs defending, no drama. Levitsky retreats the bishop to h3, not a full retreat but a repositioning. He doesn't want his bishop taken, and he keeps it on a diagonal where it can potentially cause trouble. Marshall plays rook e8. The rook that was sitting on a8 doing nothing has finally been called into the game. It lands on e8, staring down the e-file directly at Levitsky's position. And so both of Marshall's rooks are now active, one on e8, one on f8 from the earlier exchange. Levitsky plays queen to d2. Marshall responds with bishop to b4, essentially saying, I'm going to pin your knight to your queen, and then I'm going to push d4, and then you're going to have a very bad day. Levitsky sees this coming and plays bishop takes f6 immediately, trading his bishop for Marshall's knight on f6 before Marshall can execute his plan. By eliminating the knight, Levitsky disrupts the coordination Marshall was building and forces a recapture. Marshall takes back with the rook. Now Levitsky activates his rook to d1, and then queen c5, just sort of bearing down and increasing pressure on the pinned knight with the idea of playing d4 next. Well, you may wonder, he wanted to play d4 this move, so why move the queen before playing since the knight is already pinned? The reason why introduces one of the most important concepts in chess, something I'd call threat currency. It's the idea that every threat in chess carries a value just like currency. So when your opponent makes a threat, they're spending some of that currency. They're saying, this piece is worth this much, deal with it. The natural instinct, especially for newer players, is immediately to pay up by defending against it, react. But the stronger response is sometimes to spend your own threat currency right back at them by attacking their piece of equal or greater value and let them be the ones who have to react first.
Marshall can't play d4 right now, because if he does, Levitsky creates a threat of equal value by moving his knight to e4, attacking his queen as well. If Marshall takes with bishop, then white simply captures the queen, and suddenly black's not really in a pleasant situation since both his rook and his bishop are hanging. On the other hand, if black moves the queen out of the way, renewing the threat on white's queen, then white would simply take the rook first with check, and when black recaptures, he can move his queen out of the way, thereby being up 2 points of material. His threat currency definitely well spent. So to avoid any of those, Marshall parks the queen on c5. Now Levitsky has to think about that, so he moves his queen out of the pin, queen to e2. Bishop takes c3, pawn takes, queen takes, and now Levitsky plays rook takes d5, a sharp tactical shot that probably looked very good in the moment. The logic is this: Marshall's rook on e8 is undefended, so if Marshall recaptures on d5, Levitsky has a forced 3 moves winning sequence: check, only move, rook f8, now the bishop comes, forced king move, and it's checkmate. So obviously Marshall doesn't want to get mated, so he plays knight to d4, attacking white's queen. The queen evidently still wants to create some threats, so it goes to h5, eyeing the rook. Black double rooks, and then rook e5. Now in this position, Marshall has 2 ways to win the game. The first is one most grandmasters would play within a second's thought, while the other gets gold coins thrown on the table, and we all know which one he picked. Anyway, the routine win begins with the move rook takes f2. It's powerful, it's clean because you are threatening to take here, and if Levitsky takes the rook, Marshall's remaining rook has an X-ray vision on f1. So with queen a1 check, whichever piece Levitsky uses to block, it doesn't matter, it's mate. This is a good win, a satisfying win, the kind of win you show people and they nod appreciatively. But Marshall doesn't play rook takes f2. Marshall plays rook to h6. The immediate reaction is, what? The rook on h6 attacks the queen, sure, but the queen can just move. What is this? Levitsky probably thought the same thing, moved his queen to g5, and then Marshall continued rook takes h3. It looks like a sacrifice, but you cannot take with the pawn. Why? Because then I would just fork everybody. Absolutely mind-blowing. So Levitsky doesn't take, and he said, okay, I'm gonna attack your queen too and see what you do about it. But that was his biggest mistake of all, because here, in this position, Marshall played the move that got gold coins thrown on the board. Queen to g3. Oh my god, the queen lands on g3 where it can be taken by the h-pawn, the f-pawn, and Levitsky's own queen on g5. 3 pieces, 3 ways to capture it, and yet not one of them works. If the h-pawn takes, the h-file is now open from the rook capture earlier, and knight to e2 is immediate checkmate. If the f-pawn takes, the f-file opens, and Marshall's rook has a clear runway to f1. Knight to e2 check, king to h1, rook to f1 is checkmate. Same knight, different rook, same result. If the queen takes, knight to e2 check, king to h1, knight takes the queen on g3, and you can't take back because there is a double pin situation. If you still went ahead to take the knight with the f-pawn, then you get mated immediately with rook takes f1. So again, only move king g1, knight e2, king h1, and maybe something like this where Marshall has an extra piece and a completely winning endgame. But if Levitsky simply doesn't take anything at all and just makes a waiting move with the queen, Knight to f3 check regardless. You can't take the knight because of the pin, so king forced to h1, and then rook h2 is checkmate. Or if you want, queen check first, queen takes, and then rook takes is mate. Whichever way ends in disaster. Levitsky resigned. The gold coins that reportedly rained down on the board afterward feel entirely appropriate. You can spend a lifetime playing chess and never see a queen placed on a square like that, available to be captured 3 different ways, untouchable by all of them. Marshall saw it over the board in 1912, worked it out in his head before playing rook to h6, and then executed it without flinching. That's some game. Make sure to like this video if you got value, and if you enjoyed deep dives like this, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another amazing game of the century. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.